just got a call from Jim. Jim is not going to be here today. He said that they are going to be doing a review this morning with the family over what's going on with Mary, and there may be a decision to move her to Swedish Hospital down in Denver because what she's needing, the 24/7 care she's needing, they can't give her here. So right now they're waiting for that. They're going to be evaluating her situation here this morning. So Jim's not planning to be here. I understand she woke up sometime in the night. I don't know how aware she was. I don't know anything about that. But she did have a moment where she did wake up. So that's all I know. Don't have a lot of information on that. Are there other prayer concerns that we need to? Saw Jonathan yesterday. He's in a sling, but he says he's still in a lot of pain, but he's glad that the procedure is done, and he'll just, until he kind of can get into doing physical therapy, he's just going to have to live on painkillers to kind of get him through this time. And as we mentioned, Josiah's final week of classes is this week, and then finals will be the week after, so he'll be coming home that weekend, 2 weeks. Anything else? All right. Let's go turn over to Matthew chapter 19. To say the least, we spent 45 minutes or so just on the first 9 verses of the chapter, because this issue has really been the cause, I think, of division within the bodies of Christ. And it's too bad that since we have such diverse opinions, that we can't actually get together and actually just do a study as a brotherhood on this issue, because we really need to. There's one aspect that we have not addressed in talking about this issue, but we did talk about the fact of what really was behind the Pharisees asking the question in the first place. And yes, I know that at this point they were trying to do anything they could to trap Jesus in a statement. I know that. But there's a reason why they hand-picked these questions. And that's what I wanted us to see is, why is it that they're asking this question in the first place? And then they're asking the question, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any reason at all? They got the answer. They didn't like the answer, but they got the answer. And where does he take them? He takes them to the law. But actually, he takes them to prior to the law, all the way back to the beginning of creation. And he tells them what God's ideal for marriage is. So what do? Well, we don't like that answer, so let's talk about the conditions of the law. Moses told us we had permission to divorce our wives. Why did he give us that if God's intent is for us to be married until one passes? Good question. And this is where we need to understand Jesus' discussion here in chapter 19 and Jesus' point in Matthew chapter 5 on this very same issue is still under the umbrella of the law of Moses, which they're still under. Yes, I know when you turn the page after the last chapter of Malachi, you have this little section that says this, the New Testament. Okay, I know it says that. First of all, God did not put that there. Okay? Secondly, the New Testament, which is the New Covenant. Testament and covenant are the same word. Didn't actually happen until Acts. Do you know that? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, although Jesus is introducing some new teachings, they're still under the umbrella of the old law because it's not fulfilled yet. So this is a bit misleading because Jesus is still living under the law, which is why he answers the way he does. So the question that they ask then, why did Moses tell us that we are to give a certificate of divorce and then send her on her way? And Jesus answers that question a second time by saying, it's because of the hardness of the heart of man that Moses included this in the law. And we talked about, prior to sin, what hardness of heart did man have? What hardness of heart did Adam and Eve have? None. From the time they sinned, how long did it take for the hardness of heart to kick in? Instantaneous. Because we see it in the response of Adam and Eve after they knew they had sinned. We see it immediately in their children, Cain and Abel. We see it in the conditions leading up to God's disappointment that he made it in the first place and the sending of the flood. How quickly did the heart of man harden? So if you think about that, okay, did the flood wipe out all of that? Yes. But how long did it take for Shem, Ham, and Japheth's children to fall back into hardness of heart? Well, you don't read very far before they're building a tower to make a name for themselves, right? Which is what God uses as the basis to change the language. When Abraham is led out of the country, did you know his dad was an idol worshiper? Oh, you mean they had such things? Yes. In spite of the fact that all of the people had to come from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and they knew God. Okay? So we're talking about the hardness of heart. Did God know, or was God aware of the hardness of the heart of man when he made the law? I think that was the reason for the law for his people. To get them to understand that the boundary for holiness is quite far when we're dealing with sin. It's not possible to even reach it in our sin, is it? Well, it's not possible within your and my effort. That was the purpose of Jesus, right? To make us holy? Okay, so Jesus reveals why the certificate of divorce was included. And we need to understand, if we're going to talk about this issue, we need to have some understanding what Deuteronomy 24:1 and 2 says. Because if we're going to go to the Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew 19, we need to understand what umbrella, what law Jesus is talking about. Okay, but he does emphasize this, and we talked about this. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And we finished our class with talking about that. The disciples chime in. And I can imagine the disciples who probably have grown up hearing or understanding the basic ideas of rabbinical teaching on this issue were quite shocked too at Jesus' answer. But when Jesus says these words, I want you to look here at what they say. We're going to begin here in verse 10. The disciples said to Jesus, if such is the case of a man with his wife, then it's better not to marry. And Jesus said to them, but not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it's given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. Okay, so what conclusion do the disciples get to? After Jesus makes this quite bold statement about sexual immorality, what is their response? Yeah. Why do you think they said that? What's easier? Okay, easier not to deal with the commitment of marriage. Okay. You don't have to worry about divorce at all if you're not married. Alas, though, the Catholic Church has tried for many, many years to put that ideal in their church leaders. How successful has that been for them? Why is that? And don't tell me it's because the Catholic Church is a false religion. Ah. Yes. If it's better to stay single, which is what Jesus says, is it not? And it actually is what Paul says over there in 1 Corinthians 7 as well. I wish that everyone could be as I am, meaning in a single, not married relationship. And he goes on to explain that those who are married have conflicting interests because you have to take care of your family, and that sometimes interferes with your commitment to God. If you don't have that interference, then you can keep your focus totally on serving God, right? That's Paul's argument. So then tell me, how come today most Christians are married or want to be married? Think about that. If it's better not to marry, then why do we all plan according to being married in our lives? Why is that? We don't want to be lonely. Okay? But are you lonely if you're committed to God? Yes, he did. But yet, I mean, I'm just saying what Jesus says. It's better, disciples, it's better that one doesn't marry at all. And he says not everyone can receive this. He doesn't deny that that's probably the better option. Yes. I think my mom could get around the idea if I just said to her, look, I'm going to commit myself to God and I'm not going to be married. I think she could. But I think that she would also have a struggle with that. Because moms who have children who are no longer living at home look forward to grandchildren. Think about that. Think about if your son or daughter came to you and said, you know what, I'm going to commit myself to God and I'm not going to get married. How would that make you feel? I didn't hear you. Huh? It wouldn't bother you? Okay. What if it was your only child? See, maybe for you it wouldn't be such a hard thing, but for a lot of adults, you look forward to that, don't you? You look forward to having announcements of grandchildren, don't you? And I think that's a societal thing too, because that's kind of, we embrace that idea. Nonetheless, What the disciples recognize in what Jesus has said is, this is a hard teaching. And it is it not? The whole idea of staying committed in marriage with one person is a hard teaching. Suppose you marry the wrong person. Does that ever happen? Okay. So what makes this such a hard teaching? I've listed 5 reasons why this is a hard teaching. Number 1, if you go back to verse 3, because people are divorced for any and every reason. And do we not live in a society that says, if you don't like something, you don't have to stay committed? By the way, that's actually the reasoning behind living together before marriage, if you ever do marry, is the idea, let's see how it's going to work out, and then if it doesn't, then we can just separate and don't have the legal issues. That's not God's ideal plan for marriage either, by the way, or for couples either. But the fact of the matter is, because people are prone to getting divorced for any and every reason. Number 2, marriage is hard. I'd like to think that there is such a thing as a marriage that has no problems at all. Is that even reasonable? Why not? Okay, you're dealing with humans. Because even as individuals, single individuals who are used to doing things as a single-minded person now have to change that into, I've got to devote my time and attention to my spouse, my family, right? So I'm sorry, but Glenda and I probably would have some major struggles if I decided that I was just going to live my life as a single person. Go out whenever I want to, go have fun. By the way, we kind of know a little bit about that because when Josiah was just 5 months is when I got hired to do hockey for the hockey team. And I spent most of my time during the winter gone. I mean, even home games, they could come and watch the home games, but I was still working. I wasn't with them. I was up doing my job. And so there was a window of time where they couldn't come see me or bother me. Okay? But a lot of the weekends, we were gone anywhere from Lincoln, Nebraska, all the way out to Green Bay, Wisconsin. Okay? How hard do you think that was on our marriage, raising a newborn and her being a single mom pretty much for part of the year? See what I'm saying? Marriage is hard. It's really hard. Number 3, because we don't view our marriages as God does. I don't know that we always recognize that God's ideal for marriage is actually pictured in the marriage Christ has to the church. That's that imagery. That's why the bride is meant to be pure at the time of marriage. Why? Because the church is meant to be pure for the church's husband to be, which is Christ, right? It's a holy union. It's a holy marriage. And because most people don't view marriage the way God does, we don't treat our marriages as something that is holy in God's sight. And yet it is. Number 4, because the church doesn't teach about marriage very often. You know why? It's a whole lot easier to ignore this passage. You don't make as many people mad when you don't. But the fact of the matter is, The church should have been talking about this long before it got interested in it. And number 5, people don't usually choose to get into premarital counseling anymore. In fact, I've had people that have just flat out told me when they asked me to marry them, I don't mind marrying you, but I do require premarital counseling. Okay, I'll just find somebody else. That's usually what I get told. You know what premarital counseling does? It actually helps couples to see where there could be potential problems down the road that they're not even aware of. Because let's face it, when you're getting ready to be married, you are clouded by a vision that this is the ideal person, we're not going to have problems. Our marriage is going to be the exception. And there isn't a couple that doesn't think that. A couple of years down the road, all of a sudden, the guy I married is a slob and doesn't pick up his underwear off the floor. My wife doesn't know how to cook, so I have to eat burnt toast. And then when you get kids, believe it or not, that's where a lot of the problems start coming from. You know why? It's because men and women, husbands and wives, usually bring into their parenting what they learned and what they experienced from their own parents. And they're not always identical. In fact, very few times are they identical. The fact of the matter is, premarital counseling could actually help point out some of these things so that they're aware and we can talk about them before they become a reason for fighting. And unfortunately, couples aren't doing that. What are you hearing? What are you hearing about this topic being a hard teaching? Mm-hmm. They can, if they think that that's going to be something insurmountable. But what premarital counseling tries to encourage is making a couple aware so that we can talk about it now, so that there is some sort of mutual understanding of, what we need to do. So premarital counseling is just simply there not to inconvenience people. It's actually there to help educate couples who are infatuated with each other a lot of the times, and they can't see the flaws just yet. Okay. Okay. That's possible. I think that would be very hard to prove that that's what God's intent is.
But it's never even encouraged to pursue, to pray about it.
That's true. That's why I said that most people don't think staying single is necessarily a positive thing. People just don't think that. And yet, Jesus finishes this statement by talking about eunuchs. He says some eunuchs are born that way. By the way, does everybody know what a eunuch is? It's basically a man that cannot produce children. That's what the area that you use to do that isn't capable. Let's just put it like that. I remember when we first started attending the Churches of Christ, we had the preacher that was doing our class. And he said that as a joke, the kids would often come up to him and say, "Hey, what's a eunuch?" You know, because they would want the preacher to talk about what a eunuch is to these kids. And he would always answer them, "You go ask your mom or dad," or something like that. Well, it happened that as he was telling that story, his daughter was in our class. And so she, in front of the class, said, "Dad, what's a eunuch?" Okay. But he says some people are born that way. He says others have been made that way. And we know a lot of times when wars happen, they would take the physically fit males for service within their kingdom. But they, in order to use them, they would cut off that section, making them eunuchs. Daniel and the three friends are such examples of that. And we assume, even though he was married, well, perhaps Ezekiel might have been made one too. All we know is that Ezekiel was taken to Babylon, but we don't know anything about that beyond that. But he also says people make themselves that way. And that's where people have wondered, does that mean they physically cut themselves? And I think that's possible. But I wonder if there's not a separate idea here that they've chosen to make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. In other words, they've chosen to stay single. Now, I think that it's plausible for either possibility. The idea is their centered attention is on the kingdom of heaven. But a couple things. We've spent the better part of an hour on this topic. And I find it interesting that when preachers go to inquire about open positions throughout the church, that it's almost expected that you can give a 5-minute answer that's suitable and explains what your stance is on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Guys, that isn't even possible. It took us over an hour just to talk about it, and we don't even have all the answers, do we? We haven't even come up with all the answers to the questions. I think it's something we need to talk about because we want to make sure that we're a match for each other because there is such a difference in opinion on this particular issue. But to think that these can be answered in a paragraph, because I've actually done written responses. Yeah, I was thinking of, they send you a questionnaire. And they give you this little bitty space to answer what's your position on MDR. There's no way you can answer that in this little bitty section. You can't do it. It's not possible. But it leads me to a question. I've said before, I don't have a problem saying, as Jesus did, if somebody divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery. I don't have a problem saying that. What I have a problem with is twofold. Does a marriage that involves somebody who has become a Christian after they've had problems in marriage, does their current marriage always remain as an adulterous one forever? And I have a problem with that because I don't see, and maybe it's possible. I'm saying maybe it's scripturally that's the idea. But I find it very difficult to believe that a person who does not know Christ and doesn't live their lives for him and then changes that and all of a sudden realizes that I need to be committed to this marriage for the sake of Christ and changes their perspective on that, I have a struggle with answering the question, how long does it continually stay an adulterous marriage? I struggle with that. And that's why I brought to your attention David. If it started as an adulterous relationship, when did it stop being one? And my answer to that is, I don't know. What I know is, Nathan tells him, you're forgiven, means he's forgiven of that adulterous affair, and that God honored that marriage by bringing in Solomon, who would be the next king. And they would be the perpetual line to bring Christ. That's what I know. Do I have all the answers on this? I absolutely do not. So let me ask the question. And this is where we left off. Let's say, just for the sake of this, let's say a person is in an abusive situation and they end up being divorced. Okay? So immediately, what do we know? It's not scriptural under the definition of what Jesus has given us, right? Because it's not sexual immorality that caused the separation, but certainly there was reason, perhaps safety reasons, that warranted this couple separating. Is then that person never to marry ever again? What do you think? I've known preachers that actually will not perform second marriages just simply because they're afraid that they would be sanctioning an adulterous marriage. But are they ever able to marry anytime ever again? It is. Tom's grinning out there. I'm going to have Tom come in here and answer that. Here's the thing, guys. I'm going to give you my answer on that in just a second. We can come up with all kinds of these. What if this happens or that happens and they can't actually, live with each other anymore? What if this happens? What does the Bible say on that? And the truth of the matter is the Bible doesn't give us every kind of situation in marriage. Sorry, it just doesn't. But here's my answer. My first answer will be this. What does Jesus say? When the disciple said it's better not to marry, what was his answer? Okay, and what does he mean? Not everybody can accept that idea. Okay. What makes it hard? Why is it hard? Okay. Okay. I think Jesus is answering the way he does. It's not everybody can receive this because of the hardness for people sexually to refrain for the rest of their life. You know what one of the top, I think it's got number one. The number one temptation for almost every man is sexually related. And I have to believe that for ladies it might be very high on the list too. I don't know. What I'm saying is, when Jesus says that everybody can receive this, he's talking about how hard it is to be able to stay celibate and not fall into the temptation of sexual sin. I mean, aren't we grateful that there's no instances at all in the scriptures where a godly person fell into sexual temptation? It's real, guys. But if you turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I'm just going to point out two things. And then we're going to move on off this topic because we've talked about it and we've exhausted it enough. All right. I want you to see, we're not going to read everything. Chapter 7. All right. Before I get into the second part of the answer, I want you to drop down here to verse 17. I want you to see what Paul says. Let a person lead the life that God has assigned him and to which God has called him. That's my rule in all the churches. So if we're talking to the churches, talking to believers, aren't we? So he says, was anybody at the time that he was called by God circumcised? Then let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. If anybody was at the time uncircumcised, they should not seek circumcision. Now, these are the illustrations to relations, okay? What was your state at the point when God called you to be saved? That's his point. For he says, neither circumcision counts for anything, and none uncircumcision, that doesn't count for anything either. But keeping the commandments of God. Now look at verse 20. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Okay, so now I'm a divorced person. I was divorced for some other reason other than one of us was sexually immoral. Okay? What does Paul say I'm to do once now I'm become a Christian? Stay in the situation that I was in. But what happens then if I struggle with sexual temptation? Glad you asked that. Back here in verse 8. Right after Paul says in verse 6, he says, now this is not a concession, not a command. I wish that everybody were as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one kind and one of another. And then he says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But look at the next verse. But if they cannot exercise self-control, what's he say next? They should marry, because it is better to marry than to burn with passion. I looked up the word that's used here for unmarried. And you know what the word means? Not married. So, if I've divorced my wife, am I married? Not legally. If a person under the law gave his wife a certificate of divorce, were they still married? Was she free to marry? We looked at that Wednesday night, didn't we? And she could marry without being called an adulteress. Paul says it's better to stay in the situation that you're in. But if you're going to burn with passion, it's better to do something about that than to continue burning with your passion and losing your soul in hell. Doesn't that make sense? Now, does that answer all the what-if questions? It does not. And I don't claim to have all the answers on this. I welcome all thoughts, questions, statements. You don't have to agree with me. That's fine. But I've given you, to the best of my knowledge, what I think is the correct teaching on this. You're right. Mm-hmm. 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 I agree with you, and I think premarital counseling could help in that area. But I will say this. Does it make a whole lot of sense to present the gospel to somebody that's had a divorce if they can't see heaven anyway because they have to be divorced with their current situation and live celibate for the rest of their life, or return to their first husband or wife? Does it make sense to bring the gospel to them if we got to put all of these extra things before we actually allow them to be members of the church? To me, that sounds just like what Jesus said to the Pharisees, that you hinder the way to the kingdom and you're not even willing to help. That's what it sounds like to me. Because those people are perishing to hell if they're living in the way they are. without the gospel message, right? So what sense does it make then to teach them the gospel if they're going to go to hell anyway because they want to stay married? Tell me how much sense that makes to you. You see why we struggle with this? It is a struggle. And nobody in the brotherhood that I've ever come across has all the answers, although a lot of them think they do. You're going to hear me say right off the bat, I don't have all the answers on this, but I think I've taught you the best that I can with the awareness of the scriptures that I have. All right, we only got 5 minutes. We're going to 10:30 today. All right, let's just move to the next part of this in verse 13. Then children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." And he laid his hands on them and then went away. So why did the disciples rebuke the people? Why did they rebuke them? Say it again. Yeah, it has something to do with all the children. So what was it that caused them to react the way they did? What do you think? I think so. Yeah. I think that the disciples thought that they were bothering Jesus, right? So send the children away. But Jesus actually then rebukes them. And he says, don't you hinder these little children, because, he says, to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. So what does that teach about the idea of inherited sins? It sure does. Like a grape, huh? Because we've talked about this. What kind of sins do children, little infants, commit? If they don't even know what any sense of right and wrongness is, and all they can do is cry, or eat, or sleep. What have they done wrong? This is actually where, unfortunately, some people have taken Psalm 51 way out of context. And by the way, if we're born, if we're in sin from the womb, as David professes in Psalm 51, if that is literally true, then the very next thing he says after that about being cleansed with hyssop needs to be true too. Now, I want you to ask, how many people cleanse each other with hyssop? Okay, but if we're going to literalize, does that not make sense? Because in the context of that whole verse, that's what David says. Okay? So again, it goes back to, don't pick and choose which one you want to make a theology out of, but recognize what the text says. That is an interesting point. Okay, interesting point. So a different slant on the perspective that they are actually under grace if the kingdom belongs to them. You want to know something funny? I've been reading through the book of Deuteronomy this week, and I came across a passage that talks about this idea of inherited sin. Now, it's not talking about at birth, which is the theory, but here's what the book of Deuteronomy does say. A child does not inherit the sins of their fathers, nor do the fathers inherit the sins of the children. Everybody is responsible for their own sins. So what does that teach us about passed down sins? That's from Deuteronomy. I know he does. Ezekiel says it matter-of-factly. Matter-of-factly. But you know what the answer usually is when we go to those texts to teach? That's Old Testament. That doesn't apply to us anymore. And you know, there's a strong Greek word that I use when I hear that. Baloney. And sometimes I use the Hebrew word hogwash. Because if all Scripture is God-breathed and beneficial for our teaching, rebuking, reproving, that includes this. All right, we're out of time. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, confusions? All right, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for our time today. And Father, I'm grateful too that we have the liberty to talk about a topic that we'd probably just assume not to, because it causes so much hurt with people who have experienced unpleasant divorces. It causes so much confusion because of some of the vast teachings that are going on about it. Father, I'm grateful that I have chosen to humbly accept the fact that I don't have all the answers. I'm praying that each of us will recognize that even in these most difficult of topics, we don't either. But we've got to come to a place where we have the understanding we do until your word changes that perspective. Father, I pray that we as your people would recognize that you died for all, and that people live, especially when they're not in Christ, people live in broken, shattered lives because of the sins that they are conflicted with. And we deal with the people who don't know what to do about that when you offer the solution for each of us in your Son. So I'm praying, Father, that maybe today something that was said will help raise some of these questions and will help us have better conversations, not arguments, but conversations, so that we as a people can be speaking your truth and not what we propose to be your truth. Thank you, Father, for the little children and their example to us. And thank you, Father, for showing us that example. We need to pay more attention to these young ones because Jesus told us the kingdom belongs to such as them. Help us, Father, in our lives. And I pray a special prayer right now for the family of Mary. And I pray for her. I'm grateful that the surgeries have gone well, but we are certainly very concerned with our dear sister and the change that has taken place within the last day. And Father, I just pray that you will give her the best care and that you will help her through this time. Please be the source of comfort and strength for the family as well. And this I pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.